it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's special guest. Amrita Chakrabarti Myers serves as the Ruth N. Halls Professor of History at Indiana University Bloomington. A historian of the Black female experience in the United States, her scholarship revolves around issues of race, gender, freedom, and power, and the ways in which these constructs intersect in the lives of women in the Old South. Amrita's first book, Forging Freedom, Black Women and the Pursuit of Liberty in Antebellum Charleston, examines the lives of free Black women, both legal and de facto, in Charleston, South Carolina, from 1790 until 1860. Her most recent book, The Vice President's Black Wife, The Untold Life of Julia Chinn, will serve as the basis of her talk tonight. And I would love to say more about that book, but I don't want to steal any of Amrita's thunder. It's an incredible book, though, and you'll hear a little bit of Julia's story tonight, and I encourage you all to learn even more of the full story by getting your hands on a copy of the book. It'll be time well spent, and it's eminently readable, and just such an eye-opening text. So I really can't say enough about it. In recognition of Amrita's groundbreaking work as a historian, she's been appropriately acknowledged by several awards and honors, including an American Council of Learned Societies Fellowship, the Phyllis Wheatley Book Prize for Best Monograph in Black Studies, the Julia Cherry Spruill Book Award for Best Monograph in Southern Women's History, the Anna Julia Cooper James Book Award for Best Monograph in Africana Studies, and the George C. Rogers Jr. Book Award for Best Monograph on South Carolina History. We're so lucky to be joined by such a preeminent historian tonight, and it's my pleasure to introduce to all of you our special guest, Amrita Chakrabarti Myers.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good evening. Yeah, I come from that tradition where, I say good evening. I make my students do it too. I always say good morning or good afternoon, and I make them talk back to me. So it gives me a little boost. I am so excited to be here. I'm turning my computer on, but I've never been to Maine before. This is my first time in the beautiful, beautiful state of Maine, and I'm definitely coming back. It is gorgeous. The sun showed up for me today, so I was pretty happy about that. Although the earthquake also showed up, which I was a little concerned about that. But I really have had so much fun. Everybody here has been so incredibly friendly and kind and warm and welcoming and generous. And I definitely want to come back. I really want to thank Josh for organizing this entire event to bring me out here for this evening. He has just been an amazing host, not only in terms of the logistics and organizing, hotels and flights and all of that, but he took time off today to show me some of your beautiful state. So he took me to the Headlight in Fort Williams. So we walked around there, and then we drove down the coast, and I got to see some of the beautiful Rocky Maine coastline that I've heard so much about. We went to Biddeford and to the campus there, had lunch, walked on the beach a little bit, and it was just so stunning. I could not get over how blue the water was. And I'm a water baby. That's beaches and water, that's my thing. And so I'm quite serious when I say I'm coming back. You've made a convert. I love Maine. I love its people already because they've just been so welcoming, like I said. And thank you for coming tonight. This is a talk based on the new book, as Josh mentioned. So it's called The Vice President's Black Wife, The Untold Life of Julia Chinn. And the starting slide that you see up on the walls in front of you, the talk is called Puzzle Pieces and Patchwork Quilts, Remembering Julia Chinn. So this is actually a quilt that's been passed on down through the family for several generations. And it belonged to one of Julia's grandsons. And there's 2 quilts that have survived that still belong to the family, to descendants of the family today. And I was fortunate enough to meet several descendants, speak with them, look at their private collections of materials, including these quilts. I interviewed several of the descendants, and those interviews are also in the book. There's material in the introduction and the conclusion where I talked, at length with several of the members of the family. So it took 3 men to hold this quilt up to its full size. And then I took several photographs of it, and my editor, when she saw the photographs, there's a number of pictures in the book that are my own that I've taken over the years as I was doing research. But when she saw this picture, she said, that needs to be the cover of the book. And so we did. We turned the patchwork quilt into the border, if you've seen the cover of the book, into the border of the book. And of course, we got permission from the family to do that. But I think it's a beautiful symbol of the work that I had to do to put Julia's life together. A patchwork quilt, all of the separate pieces on their own don't seem like much. They look like scraps or throwaways. But when you put them together, it's a beautiful piece of art. It's the same thing with Julia's life. I had to look for bits and pieces and fragments of her in many different places. But when we finally brought it together, it revealed the story of a beautiful life, an important life. And so that to me was just it was a great sort of symbol, and that's why I really like starting with the quilt and telling you a little bit about it. So without any further ado, let me go ahead and get started and hide everybody out in Zoom land. I'm glad you could join us tonight. But let me go ahead and get started, and I look forward to hearing your questions afterwards during the Q&A period. So I tell my students, right, I teach at Indiana University, I teach undergraduate and graduate students. I tell my students pretty regularly that the study of US history is at its core the study of power relations. I happen to research power by studying sex and sexual relationships, interracial sex in particular. Now, interracial sex between slaveholders and the enslaved occupies pretty significant space in the American imagination. The most obvious example is the public's long-standing interest in Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson. But that relationship was not rare. Sex across the color line began the moment that various ethnic groups came into contact with one another on this side of the Atlantic. And those interactions were varied and complex, ranging from one night of mutual pleasure to intricate business transactions, from violent assaults to more compliant relationships, with many points in between. What my work seeks to do is illuminate how some Black women were able to use sexual alliances with white men to acquire a modicum of privilege or power in the Old South, while simultaneously revealing the very limits of that power. How much autonomy did Black women in these unions really have? What were the societal limits of their privilege? Did Black women have actual or any real choice when it came to participating in these kinds of relationships? Can consent even exist inside the confines of coercion? Is this more akin then to compliance, which is something else altogether? What kinds of constraints did these Black women in interracial relationships face inside their households? And how did white people in their communities respond to mixed race couples and their children? Of course, we know that no two situations are ever exactly the same. But we can draw comparisons between similar partnerships to draw useful conclusions about Black and white power relations in the antebellum era. So with that in mind, I turn to the topic of the new book. It appears at first glance to be the most classic of all American stories. It's the tale of an enslaved Black woman, her 2 daughters, and the white man who owned them all. It seems kind of simple. You might think, I've heard this before. A slaveholder turned politician had sex with an enslaved woman and had children with her. But this quarter-century saga isn't your usual antebellum story, and it had deep ripple effects that went well beyond the 18th and 19th centuries. Indeed, if you take a close look at it, it reveals how the United States is still struggling with the effects of enslavement and interracial sex in our present moment. And so we begin. Family tradition says that Julia Chinn was born enslaved and raised on the farm of a couple by the name of Robert and Jemima Suggett Johnson in Great Crossing, Kentucky. We don't know exactly when she was born, but former Johnson family slaves state that Chinn was only 15 or 16 when her very first daughter, Imogene, was born in 1812. That means that Julia was born around 1796 or 97, making her 16 to 17 years younger than Imogene's father, the Johnsons' son, Richard Mentor Johnson. This is a picture of Richard in his younger years, in his glory days. He was quite the dashing man about, not just Great Crossing, but the dashing man about DC, as we are going to come to discover. He was born, this is a cameo that was painted for Richard back in the day. It actually stayed in the hands of the family for generations. And it wasn't until the mid to late 20th century that a member of the family pawned it. Yes, which people in the family still are devastated about. Thankfully, it ended up in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, so it's safe. But for many years, we lost track of it. We didn't know where it was, who had it. So it's something that still really bothers members of the family that it's no longer in their possession. But Julia may have worn this. We know for certain that it actually went to her daughter Imogene, and it passed on down through Imogene's family line. So many of the women in the Johnson family and their descendants did wear this cameo until it was pawned. Now, Richard was born in Beargrass, which is now today Louisville, Kentucky, in 1780. We know that Julia was enslaved because her mother, Henrietta, was also enslaved by Richard's parents, Robert and Jemima. The senior Johnsons had moved to Kentucky from the great state of Virginia and helped to settle the new Kentucky territory. So Julia and Richard would have grown up on the same farm, but it's unclear how much time they actually spent together growing up. First of all, there's about a 17-year age gap. And Jemima Johnson supposedly raised Julia to be a house servant and trained her by hand. If so, Julia would have spent a lot of time in the main house, learning how to cook, clean, sew, weave cloth, read and write, as well as acquiring the medical skills for which she was later known. She likely lived in the main house starting in 1802, around the age of 6, which is when serious instruction began for enslaved domestics. Given the age difference between the two, however, and the fact that Richard supposedly studied law at Transylvania University in 1800 before he was admitted to the bar in 1802, and then subsequently elected to the Kentucky State House in 1804, it's possible, actually quite likely, that the two had limited or no contact while they were growing up. Richard then moved to Washington, D.C. in 1806, after he became the first native-born Kentuckian elected to Congress. Now, although she began work at a very early age, things really changed for Julia when she became Richard's housekeeper. I put that in quotes for a reason. The year was 1810. That was really when her childhood ended for good. Richard inherited a significant amount of property from his father, including 100 enslaved laborers. He then built himself a very impressive 2-story brick mansion with 2 rows of brick cabins for his slaves. When the house at Blue Spring Farm, as it was called, was finished, Richard's mother came to help him furnish his new home. She told Richard that he needed a housekeeper to keep things in order for him, a woman who would oversee everything. Jemima then told Richard that she had already gone down to the quarters and selected Henrietta's girl for the job. Julia would have been about 14 years old at this point and, quote, well-trained and almost pretty, end quote. Those are Mrs. Johnson's words. Mrs. Johnson was enthusiastic about Julia's qualities as a potential housekeeper, stating that the girl was, quote, neat and trim, quick in movement, and will not grow up bulky and awkward. She weighs only 90 pounds and will look well around the house, end quote. There is no telling what ran through Julia's mind as she got ready to move into the big house and take up her new post. This is one of the last remaining buildings on the original Blue Spring Farm property. The main house is gone, the graveyards have disappeared, the vast majority of the barns and buildings are also no longer in existence. This particular building, this is the closest I could get to it to take the photograph, was most likely a kitchen building. where the enslaved laborers would have prepared food and then taken it up to the main house. But I give you this image just to sort of at least get a sense of what some of the structures on the property looked like, that they were built from stone. And here we are over 200 years later, and this building is still standing, even though it's not in great shape. It was no small task, as I said, being a housekeeper, especially for a bachelor, right? A politician with no wife. Because there was no wife on the premises, it meant that Julia was going to be responsible for managing Richard's entire household, his whole home, overseeing the staff, organizing the fabulous parties for which Richard was already known. Housekeepers were extremely powerful persons on large plantations. Julia Chinn would carry the keys to the estate on her belt. She would handle all the deliveries of and payments for supplies and goods, choose the daily food menu, take care of any house guests, and back in the day, house guests would come for weeks or months, not just one evening for dinner, because they would travel long distances by wagon to arrive, or carriage, and then they would park themselves in your house for months. Yeah. So she had to take care of all of their needs. She also had to organize and oversee all the work assignments and handle the punishments for the domestic servants and more. It sounds like a pretty cushy gig, but there were also real risks to being a housekeeper. It was common for white men who engaged in sexual relationships with enslaved women throughout the Atlantic world to refer to their black mistresses as their housekeepers, or for their housekeepers to also be their mistresses. Indeed, there appeared to be a fine line between the two. One wonders if this very long history of sexual relations between masters and housekeepers was on Julia's mind as she prepared to become Richard's ménagère, which is what these women were called in French-speaking areas like Saint-Domingue or New Orleans, literally manager or manageress. It certainly didn't take long for this to happen. By 1811, when Julia was around 15 and Richard was 31, the pair had begun a sexual relationship that would last for the next 23 years and produce 2 daughters. Now, archival gaps mean that there are things that we just don't know about Julia. For instance, we're not sure what she looked like because there are no confirmed portraits of her. She dies before photographic technology, and no oil paintings or portraits of her have ever been turned up. If you find one online, it's a fake. Because the family, there's nothing. There's nothing for like her generation or her daughters. The grandchildren's generation is the first generation that we have images for. We do know that at only 90 pounds neat and trim, she was apparently a very tiny person. And everyone agrees that she was a woman of African descent. She has, however, been referred to in various documents as either, quote, a Negro, or, quote, an African, or brown, mulatto, yellow, or an octoroon who was, quote, fair enough to pass for white. In other words, we have no idea what she looked like because, right, the range of newspaper materials and other sources talk about her in so many different ways. Now, the nature of Julia and Richard's relationship is also up for debate. Was she Richard's legal wife? Was she his willing partner or his coerced mistress? Some people in the local area considered the pair to actually be a married couple, concluding that despite her legal status as a slave, since Richard treated Julia like his wife and she did all the labor and work of a wife, including bearing and raising his children, then she was indeed his wife. The couple's ex-slaves, years later when they were interviewed, claimed that the pair actually had a marriage ceremony, complete with Julia in a pink silk dress, guests, cake, violins that played the popular wedding ballad of the day, I Will Be True to You, and a minister named Reverend Hayes. It all sounds quite romantic, but given the couple's age difference and her lifelong status as an enslaved laborer, it's doubtful that this was a consensual relationship. He never freed her. She died enslaved. I'll just put that out there right now. Additionally, there's no Reverend Hayes in the Scott County, Kentucky census records, and I have checked. The Johnson family also had a very long history with another church called Great Crossing Baptist Church. This is the only existing image that we have of the original Great Crossing Baptist Church building. It's essentially just the size of a regular two-story home today. But this was the church. This church, Great Crossing, is only 2 miles down the road from Blue Spring Farm. It's the church that Richard's parents, Robert and Jemima, had helped to found, along with a half a dozen other couples from Virginia. They were all Baptists back in Virginia, moved out to Kentucky, and one of the first things they did when they could was found a church. Now, given the long history of this family with this church, why wouldn't Richard have asked a minister from that church, which he and Julia actually attended, to marry them? Why this mysterious Reverend Hayes, who I don't know if he existed? It would have actually made the most sense for the couple to ask this man, Thomas Henderson, to officiate their marriage, given their long connection to the man, as we will come to see. Now, Captain John Wilson, who was a contemporary of Richard's, claimed that Julia and Richard had, in fact, been secretly married by Thomas Henderson. But there is nothing in Henderson's papers, which are on file at the Filson Historical Society in Louisville, Kentucky. There's nothing in those records that suggest this, right? There was no marriage license that's ever been recovered for the pair, although that could have very easily been destroyed, lost, damaged in a flood, or by fire, which was a really common problem of the era. The Scott County Courthouse burned 3 times before the Civil War. Everything was wood, it was not safe back in the day. Whatever the legalities, people clearly believed that Julia and Richard were a married couple. Judge James Kelly, who knew Richard when the judge himself was a young man, said, quote, "Old Colonel Johnson had a mulatto wife," end quote. Richard himself referred to Julia as his wife. In a letter that he wrote to a political ally and friend, Richard referred to, quote, "my bride." He never married a white woman, ever. He didn't have any family other than Julia and their daughters. So in this letter, when he refers to this woman as "my bride," there's really no one else he could have been talking about. He also supposedly released a statement to the press during the election of 1836, which stated that, quote, "unlike Jefferson, Clay, Poindexter, and others, I married my wife under the eyes of God. Apparently, he has found no objections," end quote. Since all 3 of the men that Johnson referenced had Black mistresses or partners at some point in their lives, right, Thomas Jefferson, Henry Clay, we can assume that Richard was again referring to Julia. Even if the state didn't recognize his union, having outlawed interracial marriage, Richard, it seems, believed that the laws of God trumped the laws of Kentucky. So clearly there are things about Julia Chinn that are up for debate. This is the nature of the beast when you do archival work on enslaved and free Black women from the 18th and 19th centuries. So what then can we say about her? We know she was a woman of color. We know that she was literate, and I'll get back to that in a moment. We know that she and Richard lived together for over 2 decades, and that they had 2 daughters together named Imogene and Adeline. Richard Johnson never denied that those girls were his. He actually made sure that they were formally educated, and he called Julia his wife. And since his career kept him in Washington, D.C. for 6 months of every year, he was, a senator, congressman, and then 1-term vice president of the United States, it was Julia Chinn who handled the day-to-day business of running Blue Spring Farm. This included dealing with local businessmen and overseeing the estate's enslaved labor force. A God-fearing woman, Julia also attended Great Crossing Baptist Church, where she was baptized in 1828. I found her baptismal records. She had regular contact with the headmaster and students of a federally funded boarding school for Indigenous boys located at Blue Spring. Known as Choctaw Academy, this is the one and remaining only building on Blue Spring Farm that we know was part of Choctaw Academy. It was one of the dormitory buildings for the school. Known as Choctaw Academy, the school opened in 1825. It was a boarding school, and it remained in operation until 1848. Julia helped to run the school, And it was her labor and the labor of enslaved men and women on Blue Spring Farm that helped to make it a success. Now, it's Richard's letters to Thomas Henderson, remember the man we just met here, Henderson, who's a reverend, but he's also headmaster of Choctaw Academy. So it's Richard's letters to Thomas Henderson that give us additional insight into Julia's life. We know that she, Imogene, and Adeline all lived at Blue Spring Farm. What isn't clear, however, is if Richard and Julia always slept in the same house. There were numerous buildings on the property back in the day, including a brick dwelling that Richard referred to as, quote, my great house. Now, it's totally possible the couple lived together when Richard was in Kentucky, off, not in DC. But Julia also had her own place at Blue Spring, a stone house. In this way, her life mirrored that of other enslaved women who were in similar interracial relationships, like, for example, Anna Kingsley. Anna Kingsley was a Black woman, enslaved wife of a Florida slave trader named Zephaniah Kingsley. And we know from the archival records that Anna resided in a pretty two-story brick and wood frame home along with her children, just a few steps from the farm's main house where her husband slept. Like Anna, Julia's position in her enslaver's life appears to have earned her the privilege of her own home, and it was not a small house. Archival materials say that this house, that stone house that Julia lived in, was large enough to hold a 3-room library. And it's very likely that Julia negotiated this house as part of her and Richard's relational arrangement. As an enslaved person, however, let's be clear, Julia was not legally permitted to own anything. This was never really her house, right? Unlike Anna Kingsley from Florida, who I just mentioned, Julia was never freed. Anna eventually was. And slave owners like Richard Johnson made it really clear that their plantations and everything on them was their property. Richard told Thomas Henderson in a letter that he wrote that if more space was required for the Choctaw Academy students, he would just take over Julia's house for that purpose. Quote, at any time I could appropriate that whole house if necessary, end quote. One wonders how Julia felt knowing that she could be evicted from her home by the father of her children whenever he wished. An enslaved woman, Julia walked a really fine line between having power and being property. Still, she exercised considerable authority as manager of Blue Spring. Like slave trader Zephaniah Kingsley, Richard's job meant that he was away from home for months at a time. Both men relied on and trusted their Black wives to make sure that things ran smoothly in their absence. Kingsley noted that Anna was trustworthy and capable, and that she could run the plantation as well as Zephaniah in his absence. Richard told Thomas Henderson, who functioned in some ways as the overseer of Blue Spring, that Julia would make sure everyone did their job. Thomas would only have to help her if she became sick, just to make sure that the laborers didn't, quote, get out of hand. Holding the keys to the plantation firmly in her grasp, like other plantation mistresses, both Black and white, Julia Chinn oversaw a variety of matters at Blue Spring. Probably her most important task, however, other than raising her 2 daughters, was directing the farm's enslaved laborers. It was Julia's job to make everyone, quote, do their duty, to behave and be industrious. In fact, Julia told Thomas Henderson which of Blue Spring's slaves, quote, acts well, and who among them acts ill or misbehaves. Julia took her concerns to Thomas because he was supposed to, quote, support her authority. And he was supposed to then punish any laborer who misbehaved. In December of 1825, Julia wrote to Richard. He was in DC, she was in Kentucky. Choctaw Academy had just opened its doors, so she was much busier than usual. And to add to her troubles, she couldn't get 2 enslaved laborers named Daniel and Jerry to help her take care of a sick Native student. On top of all of that, all the male field hands had snuck off and left the plantation. They just wandered off. They left, except for 2 men named Sandy and Jacob Chase. Now, this really aggravated Julia, partly because these kinds of disciplinary issues arose every winter when Richard was in Washington. So frustrated, she wrote to her husband. Richard was absolutely furious. For the next 3 months, he wrote letter after letter after letter to Thomas Henderson about this situation. He asked Henderson to speak with Julia, figure out who exactly had been causing her trouble, and then whip the offenders. If Thomas Henderson did not want to flog the men himself, he was told to call a local constable who would come and beat the laborers for him. As a last resort, the troublemakers were to be sold downriver to Edward C. Johnson's cotton farm. It's clear from even this one incident that Blue Springs laborers did not always respect Julia Chinn's leadership. While many slave mistresses had issues when their husbands or fathers were away from home, Julia's situation was, of course, exacerbated by her race. In what appears to be a case of, while the cat's away, the mice will play, the field hands at Blue Spring pushed the limits of Julia's authority to see how far they could go when Richard was in Washington. Julia, like many other Southern mistresses, thus had to call on white men, including Thomas Henderson, local law enforcement constables, and her own neighbors, to help carry out the disciplinary actions required to enforce her authority, since she was unable and perhaps unwilling to punish the offenders herself. Now, although Julia needed Thomas's help in some ways, he was not in charge of her. Julia wrote to Richard and kept him informed about everything that was happening on the farm in his absence. In one of those letters, Julia complained about Daniel and Jerry, who I just mentioned, the 2 enslaved men, who wouldn't help her with the sick student. She also let her husband know if Thomas Henderson was doing a good job. In January and February of 1826, Julia wrote that the headmaster had been useful as of late. He had given Daniel, the problem slave, a stern lecture, and he was regularly visiting the couple's home to hear Adeline and Imogene's school lessons. And he had been of great help in making the field hands behave themselves. Richard then wrote to thank Thomas. While he was probably grateful that the man was keeping up his end of their deal, tutor my daughters, and help my wife maintain discipline at Blue Spring Farm in return for your job, which has, a paycheck, as well as free room and board on the plantation, right? So this was the deal. So yes, he was probably grateful, but Richard also wanted Thomas to know that if he didn't do his job, Julia was going to let him know. In addition to overseeing the farm's laborers, one of Julia's other significant responsibilities was organizing and hosting the many parties that were held at Blue Spring. Richard was really well known for his hospitality. Indeed, when he came home from Washington, he loved to entertain, and lavishly. Local folks said that they were treated so well when they visited Blue Spring Farm that they just, quote, loved to go. As Richard's wife, Julia got used to planning and hosting events, large and small, often on the spur of the moment. When he came home from Congress in 1824, for example, Richard and some of his neighbors got together and they invited the entire township to come to Blue Spring Farm on the 3rd of July to celebrate the nation's birthday. No ball, however, was as grand as when the Johnsons hosted the Marquis de Lafayette in May of 1825. Julia was most likely very excited to meet the Marquis, who was known for his abolitionist viewpoints. It's rather doubtful that the French hero, who was on a tour to visit all the friends that he had made during the American Revolution, would have visited tiny little Georgetown, Kentucky, had it not been for Richard Johnson, who was then at, quote, the noontide of his prosperity. Richard was super popular in the 1820s. He was a hero of the War of 1812. The supposed slayer of the native chief Tecumseh. He didn't kill Tecumseh. I'm just telling you that. But he rose to fame on that fable, and his political campaign slogan was the worst ever in 250 years of US history. Rumsey Dumpsey, Colonel Johnson killed Tecumseh. Terrible, terrible. But so it's stuck in my brain. I mean, how do you forget that, right? But so he really banked on that as part of his, political cachet. But so, here he is. He was wounded in battle, took 5 bullets, almost died. He says he killed Tecumseh. He's a sitting U.S. senator. So he's got big name recognition in the 1820s. He also belongs to one of the first families of Kentucky, right? His parents had helped to found the state and established one of the most important Baptist churches in the area. His father, Robert, had signed the Kentucky State Constitution. The Johnson men, thanks to their father Robert's position as a territorial surveyor, owned tens of thousands of acres of the best land in the state of Kentucky. And among them, they counted congressmen, federal judges, and one day, a vice president of the United States. It is not an exaggeration to say that Richard Mentor Johnson belonged to his century's version of the One Percenters. The gala that took place at Blue Spring Farm for the Marquis de Lafayette was a sight to behold. Well-dressed enslaved laborers poured out vast quantities of wine and punch, and the sound of music carried into the air as hundreds of people from all walks of life, rich, poor, old, young, male, female, streamed towards Julia and Richard's home. Every girl in town was there, dressed for the occasion, and each household in the neighborhood had helped to prepare various parts of the feast because the festivities were on a scale beyond the capabilities of any one family. Trenches were actually dug by enslaved laborers along an actual branch of Blue Spring. There is a real Blue Spring at Blue Spring Farm. And they cut trenches in order to cook roasts in the ground. And ladies from the area reportedly made a cheese that weighed 500 pounds for the occasion. There's another source that says that it was probably 500 cheese balls. I'm going with the 500 cheese balls. Because can you imagine a 500-pound cheese? There was a lot of entertainment that evening, including a speech from young Richard M. Johnson, Jr., who was the 12-year-old nephew and legal ward of Richard Mentor Johnson. There were piano performances by certain female guests and exhibitions by students from Choctaw Academy. When Lafayette left Blue Spring that day, he entered his carriage amidst the hearty greetings of a large assemblage of citizens who had gathered to take their last leave of him. Most of the work for this feast was, of course, done by the enslaved house staff of Blue Spring Farm. And it was Julia Chinn who oversaw the entire event and made sure that everything was prepared perfectly, given her role as, quote, the chief manager of the domestic concerns of the house. It's almost certain that Julia and her daughters met the Marquis during his visit. Not only did Richard recognize Julia as, quote, his wife, the mistress of his parlor, and the mother of his household, which was confirmed by everyone who knew him, he unblushingly treated the girls as his daughters, quote, placing them at the same table with the most honorable of his white guests. Visitors who went to Blue Spring that day verified that Imogene and Adeline Johnson did indeed attend the party. They were the certain female guests who had played the piano for Lafayette that evening. The girls were 13 and 11 years old when the Marquis came to visit, wearing gowns as fine as money could buy. Julia would have purchased these dresses, or she would have bought the fabric and had them specially made just for the occasion. Local papermaker Ebenezer Stedman remarked that to anyone who didn't know them, Imogene and Adeline would have been mistaken for white, since they were as light-skinned as any of the other ladies at the party that night. And there were folks from all walks of life at Blue Spring the day the Marquis de Lafayette came to visit. Rich and poor, male and female, native, black and white. The residents of Georgetown, from all accounts, ate, drank, and danced well into the night. Now, as if dealing with an unhappy labor force, keeping her husband apprised on a variety of plantation matters, raising their 2 daughters, running a 2,000-acre farm, 2,000 acres, a working business, right? And entertaining hundreds of guests at a moment's notice wasn't enough work. Julia also helped Thomas Henderson manage Choctaw Academy when Richard was away. Having the school at Blue Spring allowed Julia and Richard to quietly educate their daughters under Henderson's tutelage. It also, however, increased Julia's workload. While Thomas was headmaster, he was in charge of teaching and disciplining the students. Julia oversaw the practical tasks that kept the institution functioning. Because this was a boarding school, Julia and the other enslaved laborers, particularly the women of the house staff, had to make sure that every student was clothed, that they were fed, that they were housed, that their clothing and bed linens were regularly washed and maintained, that their rooms were kept tidy, and that they stayed healthy. This is no small job. Not even at the beginning when the school only had 25 students, but at its heyday, it grew to over 200 students. So consider the labor that would have required. There was a reason that Julia developed a reputation for being the chief manager of the domestic concerns of the house. Raising 2 children and running a household for a politician who liked to entertain on a grand scale was no small task. Julia, however, did all this and more, and she stepped into her new roles at Choctaw Academy with grace. Having been trained as a house servant, she had learned how to sew and cook under the apprenticeship of the talented Black seamstresses and cooks on Robert and Jemima Johnson's farm, where she grew up. These tools and more were put to use for the new school. For example, it was Julia who organized and directed a team of skilled Black seamstresses at Blue Spring to make the students' clothing. She also looked after their medical issues, being, quote, as good as one half the physicians where the complaint is not dangerous. Her work in this area was significant. She was such an effective doctor that Richard didn't hire an actual male physician to care for the school students until after Julia had died. It's likely that Julia acquired her medical skills, just like the rest of her talents, from the Black women on the plantation where she grew up. Enslaved women, we know, passed herbal remedies, knowledge about midwifery, and other medicinal information down from mother to daughter. We can thus assume that Julia learned most of what she knew from other Black women, including her own mother, Henrietta. Julia was also in charge of setting up all of the students' beds. This included buying coarse linen from William Johnson's store in town to make the bed ticks, or mattresses, and negotiating with a local craftsman named Campbell to construct the actual frames, or bedsteads. While it's unclear how much of the physical labor of mattress making Julia did herself and how much she delegated to the enslaved women of Blue Spring, she apparently saved the household money by, quote, furnishing some things at home with her own labor. Richard indicated, however, that even if Julia had to, quote, purchase everything, he would not object. Indeed, he stated that, quote, as to everything else, Julia has the means and can accomplish it. Perhaps she may want some aid in having a contract made for the bedsteads in the upper part of the library. Julia Chinn clearly provided a wide variety of labor to make Choctaw Academy run smoothly. What's critical to note is that she had the skill of numeracy, and she had access to Richard's money while he was away, which indicated that he trusted her. Stating that if Julia had to, quote, purchase everything, I do not object, or, quote, as to everything else, Julia has the means and can accomplish it, Richard's letters to Thomas Henderson suggest that Julia could place orders and enter into contracts with vendors for goods needed at Blue Spring, since rural stores in the US functioned on credit in the antebellum period. This is significant. It meant that Julia could draw on Richard's lines of credit, which meant area merchants recognized her right to do so. It meant that in the Bluegrass region, Julia legally functioned as Richard's wife for the purposes of transacting business. Julia Chinn also controlled some physical currency. She paid seasonal laborers at Blue Spring each year using cash that Richard had left to her. And in a letter to Thomas Henderson from February 1826, Richard noted that, quote, after the 4th of March, I can send the boys some spending money. Or if they do not choose to wait, Julia will hand you $10 for distribution for spending money if they want it. That $10 would be over $300 in today's cash in terms of inflation. Not only was Julia able to tap Richard's lines of credit in order to purchase materials for both the school and their household then, she also had access to and distributed cash to the farm's white employees and the academy's headmaster. It's really telling that Thomas Henderson, a white man who had known Richard for years and who was the school's headmaster as well as a rotating minister at Great Crossing Baptist Church, was not sent this money directly. Instead, he had to ask Julia, an enslaved woman of African descent, but a woman who was also very clearly the mistress of the plantation, for these funds. Richard Johnson trusted Julia Chinn. He also knew that she was a very savvy businesswoman. That did not mean that her life was restful at all. Being the wife of a politician from one of Kentucky's first families did not translate into a life of luxury. The success of Blue Spring Farm and Choctaw Academy were the direct result of Julia's constant work and supervision. She labored long days at the head of a slave force who worked even harder. Her sudden death at the age of 37, while caring for the school's students during a cholera epidemic in 1833, was thus not only shocking, it affected the life of everybody at Blue Spring. Richard certainly came to miss her organizational capabilities. Within months of her passing, letters flooded Choctaw Nation from students at the school complaining about everything from poor food and clothing to suspect education and dirty living conditions. Richard, overwhelmed, tried to address the concerns and persuade the chiefs of Choctaw Nation not to take their sons back home. He stated, quote, "I can pledge myself that there is not a day in the year that coffee is not furnished for every boy in the school, and that of the best quality, except during the cholera when there was some derangement in the cooking, owing to the death of the formidable cook and the sickness of others." Julia, of course, who normally ensured that everything ran smoothly at the school, had been busy nursing everyone during the epidemic. They literally set up a cholera ward at the farm because so many people became sick. But then she herself fell ill as a result and passed away shortly after Jerry, the Choctaw Academy school cook, who was also an enslaved laborer on the plantation. So the overseer of the school, essentially, and the cook both died in the same week. Again, this is in the church records that I've discovered. 2 days later, Richard wrote to Thomas Henderson and asked him to make sure that the boys kept their room and their clothes clean and tidy. Quote, "Therefore, you must keep your eyes upon their clothes, and if necessary, you can get Adeline or Parthene to furnish any deficient." Adeline was his younger daughter. Parthene was an enslaved woman on the plantation. "You can get Adeline or Parthene to furnish any deficient so as to keep them to look well. And do this without exciting other boys and without letting any person know the object, for I have said nothing of the complaints, even to Adeline." Perhaps the chiefs may be referring to letters soon after the cholera when matters were deranged, end quote. So this is the second time that he's used the word deranged or derangement. Clearly matters were deranged because Julia Chinn, who had always overseen everything at Blue Spring Farm, including the sewing and distribution of clothes to students at Choctaw Academy, had died. It's obvious, given how things changed after her death, how much Julia had contributed to the smooth running of both farm and school. Equally clear from the details of her daily routine at Blue Spring is that Julia Chinn had an extremely busy life, and that local whites appeared to accept the Chinn-Johnson relationship to a large extent. Literate, well-dressed, exercising oversight of the farm's enslaved laborers, dealing with local vendors, and interacting with the teachers and students of Choctaw Academy, as well as other parishioners at Great Crossing Baptist Church, Julia's life looked, in many respects, like that of other Scott County plantation mistresses. Some of the people that she dealt with, like Thomas Henderson, eventually became close colleagues. Other white locals either ignored her marriage to Richard or accepted it to a point, attending the parties that she organized, eating the food and drinking the drinks, worshiping alongside her at Great Crossing Baptist Church, or doing business with her when Richard was away. A fascinating life, you might say. But Julia Chinn's story isn't just fascinating or interesting, it's important. A quintessentially American family saga, the story of Julia and her daughters sheds light on how the United States continues to struggle even today with the effects of slavery. While conducting research for my book, I was really saddened by how Julia, like most enslaved women, had quite literally been erased from US history. I loved the poster that was done for this talk because there's a hand with an eraser, if you've seen it, erasing Julia from existence. I love it. I got a poster for myself. I'm taking it home with me. Few people today know who Julia Chinn was. They don't know her name. A lot of people don't even know Richard Johnson's name. The truth is that both Julia and Richard are victims of an ongoing national refusal to fully acknowledge our history of slavery and interracial sex. This is played out in various ways, including a long-standing commitment, violent at times, to segregation, the construction of the, quote, one-drop rule of Blackness, the nation's unwillingness to legally accept the existence of biracial or multiracial persons, and the corresponding inability until the last 25 years for people to self-identify as biracial or multiracial on government forms and records. All of this is indicative of the US's larger commitment to structural racism, to anti-Blackness, and what I would say is white supremacy. The depth of this historical erasure, legal and social, state and familial, was driven home to me when I met some of Julia and Richard's descendants. The thought of meeting any of Julia's family members hadn't actually occurred to me. I'm a slavery scholar, I research dead people, right? So it had never occurred to me that I might actually meet some real live descendants and get a chance to talk to them. It was the best part of this project. But when I did meet them, their stories actually shocked me because most of them did not know until they were quite a bit on in years, 60s, 70s, 80s in life, that they were descended from a vice president and his enslaved Black wife. They had no idea. This wasn't an accident. Julia Chinn hadn't just been removed from the history books of the nation. She had literally been erased from the memories of her own kin, absent in the exact same way that she is missing from the Johnson family cemetery at Great Crossing Baptist Church. Although we don't have the original church building, I showed you a picture, the one picture we have of the original church, it was just destroyed by a tornado in the 1920s. The church rebuilt, the congregation rebuilt right on the same site, but the building there now is, of course, it's a newer building. But the original graveyard from the founding of the church is still there right behind the church. And this is how it looks today. It's been declared, there's a historic marker there now, it's been declared a historic site, it's been cleaned up, the graves have been fixed up, and so it looks absolutely beautiful. If you look in my book, I have a picture of what the graveyard looked like just a few years ago before it became a historic site without the marker. And so the before and after pictures are rather stunning. Most of Richard's family members are buried in this tiny family cemetery because as founders of the church, this was literally the Johnson family cemetery. Richard's not buried there. Because he's a national hero and politician and a war hero, he's at the state cemetery in Frankfort, the state capital, where Daniel Boone and other famous Kentuckians are buried. But we don't know where Julia is buried. She's not buried here. At some point in the early 20th century, most of Julia and Richard's older daughter's descendants, Imogene, those descendants at some point in the early 20th century crossed the color line, and they stopped telling their children about the family's lineage. We live in a country where we brag all the time about if we're descended from somebody who came over on the Mayflower, a famous general, a famous president, vice president. There would have been no reason for people not to brag about this except for the fact that the vice president's wife was not your traditional wife. He did not have a traditional wife or a traditional life, as I like to say, right? And so I asked one of the white descendants, why did he think he had never known about this? Why had it been hidden from him for most of his life? And he remarked, quote, "It's a closeted secret. It's not something people were necessarily proud of. I know that it's certainly been hush-hush in our family, and whenever it comes up in other white families, it's just as hush-hush, end quote. These white descendants, whose last name, Pence, no relation to Mike Pence. Somebody already asked me that question tonight. That would have been kind of funny, actually. But the white Pences, who are descendants of Julia Chinn and Richard Mentor Johnson through their older daughter, Imogene Johnson Pence, she married a man named Pence, are really your typical American family. As one interviewee said to me, if you've been here long enough and you go back far enough, people here are all mixed up together. And that's a direct quote. Native, African, European. This is the Southern story. It's the American story. It's sex, it's race, it's slavery. It's also a story many people still are uncomfortable with and want to deny. It's why Julia and her daughters were written out of the history books. And it's why they were hidden from the memories of many of their own descendants. Because it's uncomfortable. Because Richard owned Julia. It's why we do not know to this day where Julia Chinn is buried. We have, quite literally, lost the vice president's wife. Because Blackness was and still is a stigma to so many people in this country. Because our history of slavery and settler colonialism has yet to be fully acknowledged. It's why some people are trying to eliminate the teaching of slavery and indigenous histories and genocide from our schools. They claim that educating children in history is divisive. They refer to it as critical race theory, or CRT. Not only do these people not know what CRT actually is, this isn't about CRT. It's about controlling the educational and thus the national narrative. It's about the retention of power by manipulating children who become the next generation of voters. They don't know what they don't know. It's about the maintenance of white supremacy. People in this country often speak of reconciliation, of peace, of moving forward. I say here, and I will say it really firmly, there can be no real reconciliation by erasing the past. There can be no genuine peace without truth. That means an honest accounting of the nation's collective, mixed up together, often ugly and painful histories. If we want to begin the process of national healing, the stories of women like Julia Chinn and her descendants are what we must embrace. We have to face our history, all of it. Justice demands it. I believe the ancestors demand it. So the only way out then is through. Thank you.